So this talk is productive front-end test-driven development that actually works. So just as a raise of hands real quick, who does test-driven development of any kind? Wow, okay. Automated test-driven development, so not just like your QA department. Fewer hands, okay. Who does tests on their front end? Okay, so automated tests on their front end, sorry. Okay. So things get harder as we start talking about like, oh, not just our QA script, like actually automating these, making sure that we can deploy based on whether our app works. So the talk today is going to be talking actually about rapid application development, which I originally like targeted this at kind of enterprise applications, and then I said it's rapid app development, and they were like, what? With acceptance testing, and then just mind was blown. So I'm going to be talking about things that are probably at odds, especially when you think of them mixing in with front-end development, is we're working really quickly and confidently and being able to do this at scale. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm actually used to live in Little Rock and teach at the Iron Yard down the way. So this is kind of like coming back home. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @RyanTablata. And my GitHub is @rtablata. Yes, I'm one of those people that doesn't have the same thing. Sorry. My life is like mostly code, my dog, and like random hobbies. So if you want to follow my dog on Twitter, which is just cute dog pictures and less code and less Ember's cool, you can follow Emperor Puppeteen. Whoops, I was supposed to go down. Background about myself, I work at Prototypal. So we're a consultancy, staff augmentation firm, and we do training both online in the forms of, we have a website called embercast.com that we're creating. If you go there right now, you can actually find a 20-minute free video of how to create a Trello clone with Ember. And we're releasing more courses on full stack Ember development, developing with Ember with test-driven development, deploying, and all sorts of other things. We also do custom training, so if you're interested in like JavaScript or front-end best practices, API best practices, we can do custom online or in-person training and mix that with staff augmentation or other things. So the question is, what is rapid app development? And we're now like, I think over 10 years since DHH had the video of, let's make a blog in 10 or 15 minutes with Rails 1 that he first released. And that's the idea of rapid app development, being able to quickly develop applications with code where we can get to market quickly and validate that against our customer base, making your business money. And whether that's a side project and like you can turn in and start making yourself money, or having something that your friends can use, or it's at your usual business and you're saving time and building new features and having fewer bugs. But the problem with rapid app development is it kind of gets this weird connotation of like it's a race to get features out as quick as possible, and it usually just accrues massive amounts of tech debt. So it's usually like, oh, hey, we can like just not secure this endpoint because people don't know about it, or you know, forget about best practices. The Java team's going to come back and rewrite the whole thing in Spring in 6 months anyway, so why do we need to write things well right now, you know? This isn't going to last. We're going to throw it away in 6 months. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, which every talk has to go to Wikipedia for something, they even say that like the focus on prototyping just has a hack and test methodology that just ends up with code on the ground thrown away in a Bitbucket or GitHub repo that you forget about 6 months later, and then a product manager wants to bring it back because there's some obscure feature that was only available in that one. But the idea is that for most people, rapid app development and longevity, maintenance, and maintainability are at complete odds with each other. But I question of what if we could develop quickly and confidently? And I'm going to put this in the scope especially of front-end development, because I think that with front-end development, there's so much JS fatigue and build tool fatigue and just changes in APIs all over the place that people don't feel like they can do this. So they say, let's just build rapidly because we're going to have to rewrite it in 6 months anyway, and choose the next framework and choose the next tool and choose the next thing that is going to be a breaking change. So my question is, and this is front-end development or back-end development, is choose a productive stack. Choose something that you can get things done with well, you can test them, but also make sure that there's support. Make sure that there's going to be an upgrade path in 6 months, 8 months down the road when, oh, the proof of concept now is in production and has thousands and possibly millions of users on it, because that never happens. So I'm going to brag a little bit. In the front-end development cycle is Ember.js, which I'm going to be talking about in live coding here in a minute, has actually an LTS, so long-term support contract. If you're used to Rails or Spring or .NET Core, I think Laravel has one. If not, Taylor, let's talk. But there's a security policy, there's a long-term support policy saying if you're on version 2.12 from that release, you've got 6 weeks, and then it's going to be secured down, and it's going to say this is a long-term support. We're supporting it for another 18 months after that, security updates and performance patches. And what's cool about Ember is it's a very batteries-included framework similar to Laravel or Rails, where everything's already, or a lot of what you need is built in the box. So that LTS covers your routing, your templating, your components, your services. It includes the build tool and supporting the proper versions of Node. So we support, or Ember supports Node down to Node 4, which is currently about to be end of LTS in March. We're lining up our LTS cycle so that when Node 4 is ended support, we end support for Node 4 as well. Build tools CI. So if you've ever had to work with Webpack and Gulp and keep up with what's the new thing to do, that's part of the LTS. You have 18 months of support and an upgrade path all the way through. It also includes the testing framework that I'm going to show you. That's built in the box, comes with every app when you say Ember new. And it covers Ember Data, which is like an ORM in the browser, which is really awesome, especially for productive apps that need to be configured as you change and update the way that your API works. Your front end can respond without having to go into every single controller and every single component and say, oh, we moved that network endpoint somewhere else. Okay, so we've covered, a good stack, but what about acceptance testing? What is this? So you may have heard of unit testing, which is taking a function or taking a class, and you're going to test it in isolation. Which is really good. When you're doing something like currency formatting or internationalization or validations, you want to do unit testing. Pure and simple. Like when you have a business logic that's very specific. Like if I was going to do a banking transaction, I want to make sure the transaction works at the unit level. We're talking front end, we're talking UI though, and the cases where you're doing currency formatting and not using a library that's already well tested is growing smaller by the day. Usually what I want to do is test, can I go to the website and view this list of items? Can I click on one and purchase it? Can I delete an item when I click on the delete button? Does that actually go through? So if you're thinking end-to-end testing, acceptance testing is kind of like one level down from that. So the acceptance testing that we're going to be doing today, I actually fake my API. So I'm not talking to like a Rails or Laravel server for my API. I'm just faking the network request layer. And that also lets me intercept it and make assertions and make tests that say, did I make this kind of network request? Acceptance tests are great because you may have seen a meme sort of like this, where you've got a hand dryer and a trash can, and I'm sure that the industrial engineers on both of these were great people and great teams that had everything worked out, and then you put them in a bathroom and you put a person in front of them, and it doesn't work, right? This is what I think about like unit tests. If I start from the ground and do unit test, that's awesome that my currency formatter knows to figure out if I've got location EN and 2 as my arguments, that it formats $ amount and then two decimal places. But what if I completely forget to use my currency formatter? Then it's doing no good for my end user, So acceptance testing is testing that mimics a user and exercises your entire application. So think of like your Jira stories or your Trello cards or your Asana task that says, as a user, I can do this. I can visit this page, click on this button, and see this result. That's what we're actually going to be writing. And in the front end, when you're thinking of testing tools that are acceptance level testing or end-to-end level testing, there's the big Selenium, which you've probably heard of. There's Protractor and Angular. There's WebDriver IO, and I think Josh Seifer is giving a talk that's going to cover some WebDriver stuff. There's Cypress, which is this really cool tool, but it is privately sourced, so you have to like install an application, and I think the last time I checked it only worked on Mac. But it's really awesome. It allows you to pause your application, run it in a real browser, and you can like record steps. You can take pictures so you know when it failed, and there's all sorts of cool things that Cypress does. And then what we're going to be looking at is Ember Q Unit, which is the test runner built into Ember. So when you create a new Ember project, it has testing out of the box, similar to a lot of the backend frameworks. So you don't have to customize your own testing framework, although you can. Like you can switch out, if you want to use Mocha, you can use Mocha. I think that there's even things to use like Gherkin-style cucumber tests with Ember CLI. If you're in the React world, you might notice that I didn't include Jest. Jest, at least out of the box, doesn't use a true browser, and I think that acceptance tests or end-to-end tests should use what a real user should be using. So you're not using Phantom.js, or you're not using a string version of your DOM. You're saying, go open Chrome, go open Edge, go open Internet Explorer 11, and visit my page. How does it interact on those real browsers, not how does it interact with JS DOM, because except for the few weird developers that probably will visit your site with JS DOM, probably to scrape it, no one's using JS DOM to look at your site and interact with it. So test with what your users test with. Cool. And if you notice at the bottom, the slides are actually done. That's because the rest of this talk we're actually going to be live coding a test-driven application, a CRUD app. So I know that in the abstract, I think I said I was going to be doing a t-shirts application. I've done that a few times, and a lot of my students hated t-shirts when I used to teach at the Iron Yard. So I switched that to using like a cars application, which there's some caveats to that as well. But the idea is the same. We're building a fairly simple CRUD application, and I'm going to show you kind of the testing tools along the way, and we're going to build it together. And I know that live coding usually, that's my finished version, live coding usually might be like hard to see, or you might have questions along the way. So usually the talk would be like talk and then questions at the end. But if you have questions along the way, raise your hand and I'll try to repeat them for the video and then answer them as we go through. Yeah? Yes, so the final code actually is up on GitHub. So we're probably, the way that I've practiced this is we probably get through index and create. I've got detail ready to go. But if not, detail and delete are up on GitHub. And I hope to do like kind of a step-by-step, just like blog post on how to follow along after the talk. Cool, so it's up on GitHub. So I have here an Ember project. I have installed like one or two very common add-ons. I've installed Ember Bulma for styling, because even though I was very ambitious and wanted to custom style my entire application, I woke up at 8 o'clock this morning and said, hey, I need this to be styled. So there's that. I've also included something called Ember CLI Mirage. So if I remember when I described acceptance testing, I'm going to stop at the network layer. Ember CLI Mirage is a fake API server. It does serialization, it does an ORM, and it intercepts all network requests leaving the browser and treats them. It even can like time delay them, does it all asynchronously, so it works like a real network request. But it allows me to interact and make assertions. So I can say like, was there a car created with a network request over JSON API? I can make an assertion that says that. And I installed, I think, like one test formatter and my ESLint. But all the testing, all of the generators that you're going to see come straight out of the box when you say Ember new by installing Ember CLI under computer. Okay, so we're doing test-driven development. So with Ember, it's really awesome. When you start up your server, yarn start, npm start, or Ember serve, any way you want it. You can go to localhost 4200, which is usually your app. If you go to localhost 4200/tests, this is actually your live test runner. It's doing live reloading, running your tests. It even has everything set up so your failing tests get run first. That's something I didn't actually realize until one of my coworkers that's on the Ember CLI team said, hey, you know, it runs your failing test first if you just don't mess with the configuration. I was like, oh, that's really nice, because my failing test is what I want to work with first. So we need a test. We need an acceptance test. And we need a test to test when we're listing out all of our cars. So I'm going to run Ember G. So if you're familiar with Rails generate, Ember CLI has a generators tool. So I can say generate an acceptance test for cars index. And you could put this in nested folders or whatever. I'm just kind of naming it from just letting it be kind of flat in the way that it's named. And let me bump this up a little bit. Is that better? Cool. So I'm going to generate a cars index test. And it has now generated a file for me. And I'm going to go back to the browser, and then we're going to look at what it does. So it creates an acceptance test that automatically runs. And it says the URL cars-index didn't match any routes in my application. So I haven't written any code yet. I've just run the generators, and I'm already getting a new test in my application. It's not quite what I wanted, but we'll get there. So I'm going to bring up that cars index test in my editor. And once again, let's increase it a little bit. So it says visiting cars-index, and that's because it's based on the file name. When you generate it, it kind of creates this default based on whatever you name your files, but that's not really what I want. I just want to go to /cars. And let's give it a little bit better description. We're going to say that visiting cars does not redirect. The other thing that's really cool with Ember and Ember CLI is if you've ever had to deal with like Webpack configurations and targeting certain versions of Chrome, all of that configuration is baked out of the box. So I can even use ES6 async and await functions right here to work with my asynchronous code. Don't have to install anything else. I just say async, and this gets transpiled, although right before this, I found out that async and await works in every browser except for Opera Mini, so don't even really need it to be transpiled. So what I'm doing is I'm saying visit the cars URL. URL. I'm talking about real browser things. And then I'm asserting that the URL is cars. This is a really boring test, but if you're wanting to do redirects and you have like certain pages are available to guest users versus logged in users, this is actually something that could be really useful. So I want to make sure that visiting cars doesn't redirect me to somewhere else or give me a 404. So if I go back to the browser, it says visiting cars does not redirect, and I get a really nice error message from Ember that says unrecognized URL error, and the assertion even says the URL cars did not match any routes in my application. So I now have something that I can work on. So I can go to my terminal once again. I could write this out like kind of outside of the terminal, but I'm just going to do it in the terminal because the generators are awesome. I'm going to Ember G, a route, cars index. And I'm jumping one step ahead. Usually a lot of people would do cars and then they'd be like, oh, well, /cars needs to do one thing and /cars/1 needs to do a different thing. So you can do nested routes in Ember, and by saying cars/index, that nests an index route inside of my cars. The other thing is the generators are a little bit different than what I like with ESLint. So I'm going to ESLint fix that so we don't get any weird errors. And just by generating that route, my application has now passed its test. Okay, that's great. We probably want more, though. We definitely want more. What? Saslint. OK, so the next thing is our user can't navigate to our page. So we want to be able to, yeah.
What did that yarn ESLint fix?
Yeah, so ESLint is a linting tool to make sure your code styles are working. So ESLint fix was just a quick command that I added to my package.json that runs ESLint on all my folders with -- fix, which changes like white spaces, missing semicolons, changes regular functions to arrow functions where they're possible, and a few other things. So it's cool. Thanks, great question. So we want to test that we can actually navigate between our home page and our cars page, right? Because this is one thing that happens to us as developers, and I know that I have it in applications that I've built where I'm like going along and I'm like, oh yeah, this route works great, give it to the project manager, and they're like, how do I get to that? I'm like, oh, you just type in this thing in the URL. Oh, I forgot to add it to the nav bar. Great. So we should probably test that we can get to it in the nav bar, and this is a valid test for us to have. User can navigate to cars index. Okay, so I'm going to visit, I'm not going to visit cars, I'm going to visit the home page, and then I'm going to await clicking on an element. Now I could say something like, let me pull this up because I know that in the back it's kind of hard to see. I could say something like go to the nav bar, find an unordered list, find an LI, and then find a link. But I know for a fact that I'm going to go and give this to my CSS guru, or another developer is going to come back, and that other developer is probably me 6 months down the line when there's a bug, and that selector is going to change. There's no way that that anchor tag is going to stay the first anchor tag inside of a nav, inside of a UL, inside of an LI for the entire life of the application. So this is a brittle test. So instead, what I like to use is a pattern that I found through the Ember community, is I like to set attributes. So you can actually select attributes by doing square brackets. So I can say select an attribute called data test nav, which I'm just making this up. Anything that starts with data dash, you can actually add to any element and still valid HTML. So I can say data dash nav dash test for cars. So click on that, and then let's assert that we're on the cars route. Another thing that's really cool is one plugin that I have installed, so that was another thing that I did install, was called Ember test selectors. So as your application grows and you have a lot of tests that use these data-test attributes, that's more information that you have to give down the wire to your end users. And they don't really need all of those in their HTML because it doesn't make the application run. It's just used for testing and development and debugging. So Ember test selectors will actually strip those out of your entire application for you as you go to production, which is really cool and awesome. So I've created that test selector. Let's go to the browser, and we've got an error that says element data test nav cars not found. And this is usually where in acceptance testing or end-to-end testing, you're like, okay, I'm going to go boot up my app and figure out how I can recreate this scenario and figure out exactly where my assertion failed and try to recreate that issue. And the API wasn't set up right, and I'm not logged in the correct way, and all of these problems. You know, we're doing a pretty simple test right now, but things can be really complicated in the scenarios to get to the point where you're actually failing. And I don't like to do just like console.log debugging. So what I can do is in Ember, similar to what I was talking about with Cypress, I can actually say pause test anywhere in my tests, and it will stop the execution of all code right there. This is what's cool about running my tests in the browser is now, you may have seen it kind of flashing if I got to the test early enough, but there's a box running my entire Ember app at all times at the bottom of my test runner. And if I really want to see it full screen, I can hit this development mode, and it hides all the testing UI and only shows your app where it is at that point. So our app right now is just the welcome screen that comes with every Ember app. So I want to change that and actually have a nav bar. I'm going to go to the application HBS. If you're familiar with like a layout template, that's what this application.js is, or HBS. It wraps everything in your application. So I'm going to create that nav with a UL, with an LI, with an anchor tag, and I'm going to say cars. I'm not going to play with anything. I'm just going to leave it like that. And when I do that, I get a little tiny link at the top of my app that says cars. Cool. Let's get rid of our pause test. You can also go to the Chrome console and say resume test now. So I'm going to undo pause test and see what happens. We're still getting an issue. It says data test nav cannot be found because our anchor tag doesn't have that test selector. So now I'm going to add that test selector and save it. And this happens a lot with front-end development because I use a regular anchor tag. And when you click on a regular anchor tag with a blank href, it's just going to reload the browser. And there's nothing to stop you with that. So Ember's not magical like stopping the way that anchor tags work all over the place. It's saying anchor tags should be anchor tags, leave them alone, and we're getting this, and I'm going to do that so it doesn't drive everyone nuts. But what we want to really do is we want something that is an anchor tag within our application, within our router that knows about our app. In Ember, that's called a link to. So I can say create a link to, and we want to link to the cars route. And if you notice, I'm actually just replacing the anchor tag. I'm leaving data test nav. It even can take classes and everything, so you don't have to remember like class name or class bindings or anything like that. Just components work just like you would have a regular element. So change that to a link to, and our tests are passing. Cool, we've got one thing down. The next thing is we want to be able to see actual cars listed on that cars page. Well, this is where acceptance test gets really tricky, and this is where usually people are like, test it in dev. Hit it against a Rails server, test it in dev, make sure it works, and just get on with it. But I think that that's an issue with it's hard to get the tooling right for this. It's hard to intercept those requests and actually map that, which is what is really cool about Ember CLI Mirage. And there's now, I think, efforts to make that available to like Vue and React apps as well. But I have a full test server running in the browser. So I can say, okay, test user can see cars list, async, assert. I'm still going to visit the /cars route, but I'm going to do a little bit of setup before that. I'm going to actually tell my API, hey, I want you to start out with a random number of cars. So I'm going to say server.create. So in this case, server is Ember CLI Mirage's server. And I can say, go ahead and create a car. But I don't want to create one. I want to create like a random number of them. So I can say create list and give this faker random number with a minimum of, let's say 5 and a maximum of 20. It's actually pretty fast, and I need to import faker. One of the reasons I used to do or sometimes I'll do just I'll just put in a number and just say like, create 33 cars. The issue with that when you're thinking about testing is that then you can just literally hard code 33 elements on the page and make that test pass, and it doesn't inform possible bugs down the way. So I've started using like faker or a randomization library to always have different numbers of elements showing up so that I actually have to rely on the data from the server, unless maybe I say filter the top 5, and then I would hard code in 5. So Ember CLI Mirage. So I've created 5 fake cars. I visited the cars page, and I'm going to save it here because I know that there's going to be an error popping up in my browser. So promise rejected during user can see cards list, and it says you called server.createCard, but no model or factory was found. So Ember CLI Mirage, so if you're used to like Rails test factories or Laravel has test factories, if you're used to that, Ember CLI Mirage factories and models are the same idea, that you have a factory of how to create fake data for your test. So it even tells me create Ember G Mirage Model. So I'm going to run that command, and I'm going to run Mirage Factory. And this is one of the spots where I will copy and paste some code from my finished version, because I could sit here and talk out like the different faker methods that I'm using, but I think that there's more interesting stuff in actually creating the tests. So factory car. Factory car. I will talk through it, but I'm not going to type it out. So each car is going to have 4 properties: a brand, a series, a year, a color. It also gets an ID automatically. I'm just using like Faker.js's a few different methods to get like fake company names, a fake year from a date, and just a random red, blue, white, or silver. Okay, questions? All right, so now it's saying, hey, we fixed that. One of the things that I always do is I always check in on my test. After changing a file, I always check in my test. Does it give me a new error? Did I forget a syntax, like a syntax error somewhere? And it's saying expected at least one assertion, right? You can't have a test without saying the test should test something. So we need to assert some things. So I'm going to say find a few elements on the page now. So I'm going to say car items is find data dash car, data test car. And then I'm going to assert equal that car items dot length to array. Car items dot length should be the same length as the number of cars in my server. And remember, that's variable, so I can't just hard code in 5 or something. So I have to say server database. So I have a fake database for my API, cars length. Usually, and I'm going to paste in, and if you look at GitHub, all of these actually have like messages for the assertions. I'm not doing messages because I'm talking through them, and then don't want to like sit there thinking of what I'm typing out for my messages and then wasting some time. So what I'm testing here is that the car items in the browser, these elements that I'm finding, matches the same length of all of the cars in the database. And if I go to the browser, find to array. Yeah, there we go. So I get a really weird error that just says 9, 0, -9, and even if I had a message, it wouldn't be much better. It wouldn't tell me what to do next, because it's just really saying like, there should be 9 elements. Why should there be 9 elements? What elements should there be? So what's cool is with find, I can actually add an assertion to say, hey, there should be at least one data test car, and then we can kind of go from there. So I can say find with assert for data test car, go back, and now it says element data test car is not found. So I need to go to the HTML for my index page, my car index page, and start creating this element. Okay. Car index HBS, create an unordered list, create a list item, data test car. That's it. I'm not going to go and make like 20 of these or anything. I'm just going to do one because I want to see, am I in the right spot? Am I creating HTML in the right place? Did I just delete code that some other developer put there and I didn't know what it was? Especially if you're learning the framework for the first time and you haven't like practiced this talk in this app a few times, you might not be in the right file. I've done it at 2 o'clock in the morning and been like, oh wait, I just edited a file for 45 minutes and it's the wrong template. My tests are still failing. Okay, so now we've got at least one of those elements. So we know we need to repeat those a certain amount of times. And we need to repeat those based on the data from our API. And this is where Ember's ORM, Ember Data, comes into play. Instead of saying like, oh, make a fetch request to this URL, and then take that fetch request and parse the JSON, and then, I already know about a few cars, so what are those duplicates and what can be removed? If you've written like reducers that have live reloading and background data tasks, you know that this is actually like really complicated to dedupe your data and to find things going on. So what's really nice about Ember Data, and Ember has a way that when you visit every page, there's something called the model hook in Ember for a route that lets you load in data. So you can say, what's the data for this index page? What's the primary source of truth? I can say, well, go to Ember Data and find all of the cars. So this is fairly similar. If like you're used to a active record implementation, you might say cars : all or cars.all. I can't remember what it is in Entity Framework. That's leaving me at the moment, but it's a fairly similar API to what you would be used to in an active record or an ORM-based system. I should be getting an error right now. Why am I not getting an error right now? Store, find all. Cars? What is going on? Do I have old code sitting around? No. Oh, yep. I misspelled model, so that function wasn't even running. Awesome. Live coding. Would never have it any other way. All right, so no model was found for a car. So Ember Data is like, hey, you told me about this resource, but I don't know how to map that to an endpoint. I don't know, should that be talking to JSON API? Should that be talking to Firebase? Should that be talking over GraphQL? All of these you can configure and support. I'm going to be doing JSON API right now, but if you're using GraphQL or you're using a legacy API, I've even seen one of the coolest things I saw and was a few years back was iTunes had a SOAP XML API that you could hit publicly from a browser, so it had cores enabled, and someone made an entire adapter for Ember Data that talked SOAP to iTunes. And they mapped the entire iTunes app library and song library into Ember Data in an Ember app, which was just crazy. And would have been lots of weird XML parsing. So I can Ember G a model, and I'm going to cheat and hit up on this. So I'm generating a model for car, and just like you can do with Rails and some other libraries, I can actually define the attributes that I need. And yes, I could typecast these and say that cars or brand is a string, series is a string, year is a string, color is a string, but if I don't typecast them, it just kind of takes in any data that it wants. But it is important to note that you have to define which attributes are local versus which attributes you actually want to sync via the API. So if I didn't do this, even though my API might have those values, they wouldn't get, like when I referred to them locally in my application, there's ways to get to those private values, but they wouldn't really be as readily available. So, okay, I've created that model. Hopefully no error. Okay, now we get a new error. Your Ember app tried to make a GET request to /cars. What GET request? I didn't do any GET requests. I didn't make a network request. I didn't use jQuery.ajax or a fetch request. So Ember Data's ORM, by default, comes out of the box and says, I want to talk JSON API to localhost 4200 and base all my URLs on the model names, which is really nice. If you stay to conventions, you can be incredibly, incredibly productive. You can also configure this to talk to like localhost 3000 or myapp.com. So it's not like it's like baked in the box and you have to run with it. We actually always configure where Ember Data points to. Okay, so this issue is actually at my fake server level. So I have to go to my configuration for Mirage. Luckily, there's nice tooling that I don't have to write like express handlers with request and response for each one of these and do all the data serialization and look them up from the database and everything. If you're sticking to your normal serialization and normal CRUD actions, there's shorthands. So for like 80% of your resources where it's just create, read, update, destroy, or maybe it's just create and read, you don't have to do like that much work. You can just say, hey, there should be, my API should respond to /cars. And that's it. I'm gonna make sure that this is patched just in case we get to updating. So now Mirage is set up. That's outside of Ember, but now Mirage is set up. We're getting back to our old thing. So I know that this is a lot of steps to get back to put 11 divs on the page. So now it says we needed 12 of those car item elements on the page. We only have one of them right now. And that's because we still have hard-coded one. There's no Ember magic to loop through things. You express in regular code. So it's handlebars, but you say, I want, I want to loop through each data from my model, so that waits till your network request is done. There's also loading and error pages that you can use. So I'm going to create each model. So if you're used to a for each loop or a for in loop, it's the same thing. So I'm going to loop through my model array or collection and create an element. What the? Oh, ESLint. That fancy thing again. Okay. So now we've got our test passing. Great. It's an empty LI. It's not doing anything. So I'm going to go to my index test on my finished version and bring in a few more assertions. Cool. So what these assertions are doing is it's looking now for the brand, the color, the series, the year, and then going through all of the items in my database and all of the elements that it finds on the page and making sure that the inner text of the element, what the user sees, matches the values in the database. Which, of course, if we go to the browser, data test car brand is not found. So let me go ahead and do that. Span data test car brand. Should be car.brand. All right. There is an aha moment at the end that I will say. And if you're wondering what the heck is a car series, try to name anything model in any like framework or piece of code as a property name, and you break everything. Yeah. So car brand series. There's ways to configure that with Ember Data and Ember CLI Mirage. I just didn't want to have a bunch of abstract code that was like rename model to __ model. So that there's no. I didn't want to do that. The other thing is it doesn't matter what order these are in. So if my designer says, oh, year needs to be first, right? We don't care. We're just looking at these data selectors. Now, you may want to do an end-to-end test that says validate that year comes first and car comes next and series goes next. But I usually say make sure that the data shows up on the page, and that's good enough. And expected index test to pass ESLint. It's probably because these things are indented too much. Yes, cool. So you're probably thinking, great, tests are passing, he's been talking a long time, I have no idea what this app looks like. Yep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right here and I'm just going to say pause test, our good old friend. At any point I can do that. Notice I'm not looking at the live development app. I'm only test driving this. But I kind of have these ways of seeing what the app looks like. So this is what our app looks like right now if I were to go to the car index page with roughly 5 to 10 or 5 to 25 cars on it. Beautiful. Gotta love not having styles. All right. I'm trying to think time-wise. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of bring my aha moment up a little bit. just so that we can keep working on like either a detail or a create page, because those are really interesting. So, like I showed you, like that doesn't look, I would not push this to production. Wait, what? Development mode? I would not push something looking like this to production probably. Even for like hobby apps for myself. I mean, it's okay, it works, but yeah, I want something a little bit more. So luckily, since I'm using Bulma, I'm using some styles, I went ahead and created a different index page, and I styled it. Let me also go to the application page, just so that we get everything styled really nice. So I've added some styles. I've added a bunch of divs, I've added a bunch of list items, I've added actually headings, and but you'll notice that there's still that data test car year, data test car brand. Everything's there. There are a few extra link tos that I need to make sure I get rid of, because those will not work, because I don't have them in my app. So, designer has come in, and has restyled our entire application, and this is what it looks like now. What's the question that we should be asking now that we've made changes? Do the test still pass? I'm going to get rid of that pause test. Leave dev mode, because dev mode doesn't let me know where the failed or passed tests are. And we are completely green. So even though we've completely redesigned the application, we still know that the core functionality that we've described based on acceptance tests pass. There's a little caveat that our API still needs to validate the contract that we've created, but since right now I'm using JSON API specification, that's actually a pretty known quantifier. If it can pass the JSON API specification for my cars route and it has those 4 attributes, we should be golden. All right. Got a little bit of time. Do I have a little bit of time? How much? Oh, 12 more minutes. Sweet. Yeah, I can keep talking. All right. So what I'll do is I will generate Ember G. I'll show you what it looks like to do an acceptance test for creating, because that's much more interesting. Is it cars new? Cars create. Car. Come on. Cars new. Let's go with it. And I will kind of describe what this test is doing, and then I do have the final code with styles and everything on GitHub. So my cars new test looks actually pretty similar. Visiting cars new does not redirect. Navigate to car new. And then we have the test that's actually kind of the interesting bit. I'm going to visit car/new. I'm going to fill in some inputs for the brand, the series, the year, the color, and then I'm going to click on a submit button. And then once I'm done with that, because of my tooling, I can assert that we've now redirected, which would be kind of important, that once you submit this form, especially if our users are used to server-side rendered applications where clicking submit on the form makes a whole new HTTP request, sends it, refreshes the page, brings you back something new. I want to go to /cars. I want to make sure that my server database, so look at this, I'm able to talk to my database of my server and assert that there is now a new car saved to that database. And I can even get that car. I don't know why I didn't use destructuring there, but I didn't. And I can check that all of the attributes have been saved. So with this, you have really expressive tests, and I didn't do error states. I should have done error states, and I probably will add them to the GitHub repo. I'm able to check that my application works. And because the tooling is standardized, the ability to do this is fairly productive. It's built in. I'm not adding extra libraries that I'll have to keep updating. I have these tests to make sure that something that I've built rapidly, so I've done this in roughly an hour, less than that because I took so long on the intro slides. I would say that you probably, after a little bit of getting used to Ember, could probably do this in about a day to 2 days. I've had junior developers being able to create this kind of functionality, fully test-driven with error states, in 1 to 2 days. So that's viable. Now I'm doing basic CRUD. When you get into reporting, it takes a little bit longer, or things that aren't pure CRUD procedures, and you actually have operations. But I think it's available. The tooling is there. So I guess the question, I know that Daniel talked a little bit about kind of having talks open up your thought process is, well, I'd love for you to say, cool, we're going to jump in on Ember, and if you are like that, talk to me. Cool. Because that's really exciting. I really love that this is all pretty much built in, baked into the community. But maybe you go to your team and you go, hey, we need an acceptance test story for our app. We need to be testing our network connections. We need to be testing our rendering. We need to be testing user interactions and asynchronous behavior. And we should still be doing that while being productive. So I guess in close is it's doable. You're able to be productive and still test at the same time. It took me a long time to get to where I wanted with that, but it is doable and you can implement it with your teams. Theme. Any final questions? I know the next speaker is probably ready to kick me out. Yeah. What is HBS? So HBS is Ember uses handlebars for its templating. So like React uses JSX. So Ember uses handlebars for its templating. Yep. So that's what the curly braces are.